The first light of dawn crept across the village of Lanciano like a hesitant whisper, casting long shadows through the narrow cobblestone streets where morning mist clung to ancient stone walls. In the year 750 AD, this modest settlement nestled in the rolling hills of Italy seemed untouched by the grand ambitions of distant kingdoms. Its rhythm was dictated by the bells of the monastery of San Lanciano, which stood sentinel over the community like a weathered guardian. The monastery's bell tower pierced the grey sky, its bronze bells calling the faithful to morning mass with a resonance that had echoed through these hills for generations. Yet today their familiar song carried an undertone of something unspoken, something that would soon shake the very foundations of faith itself. Father John, a monk assisting the village of Lanciano, moved through the monastery's dimly lit corridors with the measured steps of a man who had walked these paths countless times, his brown basilian robes rustling softly against the cold stone floor. The pre-dawn silence wrapped around him like a shroud, broken only by the distant sound of his fellow monks' chants while preparing for the day's first service. His weathered hands, calloused from years of manual labor alongside his spiritual duties, carried the weight of more than just the sacred vessels he prepared for today's Mass. At 52, John's face bore the gentle lines of a man who had spent decades listening to confessions, offering comfort to the dying, and breaking bread with the hungry. Yet behind his kind brown eyes lay a darkness that no amount of good works could illuminate. As he arranged the altar with practiced precision, smoothing the worn linen cloth that countless prayers had blessed, John's movements betrayed nothing of the storm raging within his soul. The morning light filtering through the monastery's narrow windows cast dancing patterns across the stone walls, illuminating the faded frescoes that told stories of saints and miracles, stories that once filled his heart with wonder, but now seemed like distant fairy tales whispered to comfort children afraid of the dark. He had learned to mask his inner turmoil behind the steady voice of liturgy, the practiced gestures of consecration, the warm smile that had earned him the love and respect of every soul in Lanciano. The villagers began to arrive as the bells announced the hour, their footsteps echoing in the small chapel that had been their spiritual home for generations. Among them was Elena, John's 20-year-old niece, her dark hair covered by a simple white veil that framed her face like a halo. She moved with the quiet grace of deep faith, her eyes reflecting a serenity that John envied more than he dared admit. Behind her came Marco, her younger brother, his 17-year-old face already marked by the skepticism that seemed to define his generation. Where Elena knelt in prayer with hands folded and eyes closed, Marco fidgeted restlessly, his gaze wandering to the windows as if seeking escape from the confines of ancient ritual. John began the Mass with the familiar words that had shaped his life for over 3 decades, his voice carrying across the small congregation with the authority of absolute conviction. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, he intoned, making the sign of the cross with a gesture so natural it seemed etched into his very being. The Latin phrases flowed from his lips like a river following its ancient course, each word carefully pronounced, each pause precisely measured. Yet even as he spoke of God's infinite love and mercy, even as he proclaimed the mystery of salvation that had supposedly transformed his own life, John felt the familiar hollow ache in his chest that had haunted him for 5 long years. The memory crashed over him like a wave, as it did every morning when he spoke these sacred words. 5 years ago, in this very chapel, he had prayed desperately over the fevered bodies of his sister Maria and her young son Luca, his hands trembling as he administered the last rites while the plague ravaged their frail forms. Maria, barely 30, had whispered his name with her final breath, her eyes searching his face for some sign of the divine comfort he had always promised would come. Luca, only 8 years old, had simply closed his eyes and slipped away like a shadow dissolving at sunrise, leaving John to wonder where God's mercy had been when innocence itself cried out for salvation. Kyrie eleison. The congregation responded in unison, their voices rising in the ancient plea for mercy that had echoed through centuries of human suffering. John continued the liturgy, his trained voice never wavering, but internally he echoed their words with a desperation they could never imagine. Lord, have mercy indeed. Mercy on a priest who could no longer feel the presence of the God he served. Mercy on a shepherd who led his flock while lost in his own wilderness of doubt. Mercy on a man who had built his entire identity on faith that had crumbled like ancient parchment in his hands. The weeks following Maria and Luca's deaths had been a blur of well-meaning condolences and gentle suggestions that their passing was part of God's mysterious plan. John had nodded and smiled, offering the same platitudes he had dispensed to countless grieving families over the years, but the words tasted like ash in his mouth. How could he speak of God's love when that love had allowed an innocent child to suffer? How could he promise eternal peace to the dying when death seemed like nothing more than an ending, final and absolute? The questions had multiplied like shadows at dusk, each one darker than the last, until John found himself surrounded by a darkness that no amount of prayer could penetrate. Yet still he continued his duties, driven by something deeper than faith, a love for his community that transcended his personal crisis. When old Giuseppe's roof leaked during the autumn rains, John spent 3 days repairing it with his own hands, his back aching as he fitted each tile with meticulous care. When the widow Francesca struggled to feed her children, he appeared at her door with bread and soup, never mentioning the source of his generosity. When young Thomas fell ill with fever, John sat by his bedside through the night, placing cool cloths on the boy's burning forehead while whispering prayers he wasn't sure anyone was hearing. These acts of service had only deepened his inner torment. The villagers looked at him with such trust, such absolute confidence in his spiritual authority, that John felt like a fraud perpetrating the cruelest deception imaginable. They came to him with their deepest fears, their most desperate hopes, their questions about eternity and meaning, and he offered them words of comfort drawn from a well that had long since run dry. Each grateful smile, each whispered, "Thank you, Father." Each blessed sign of the cross made in his presence felt like another weight added to the crushing burden of his deception. Elena approached him after Mass one morning, her face glowing with the kind of simple joy that John remembered from his own youth. "Uncle John," she said, using the familial term that had always brought him comfort, "I brought you some bread that we baked this morning. You've been looking thin lately." Her concern was genuine, her love evident in every gesture, and John felt the familiar stab of guilt that accompanied such kindness. If only she knew that her beloved uncle, the man she looked to for spiritual guidance, could barely bring himself to believe in the God he served. "Thank you, my child," he replied, accepting the warm loaf with hands that trembled slightly. "This bread is a gift from heaven." The words came automatically, part of the gentle discourse he had perfected over years of caring for his village, but they felt hollow even as he spoke them. How could he speak of gifts from heaven when heaven itself seemed like nothing more than a beautiful lie designed to comfort the living? Marco, who had been listening from nearby, rolled his eyes with the casual irreverence of youth. "Uncle, surely you don't believe bread comes from heaven," he said, his voice carrying the challenging tone that had become his trademark. "It's baked in her kitchen, using grain from the fields. Where's the divine intervention in that?" His words were meant to provoke, but they struck John like arrows finding their mark. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought, came truths that theologians spent lifetimes trying to avoid. "Marco," Elena chided gently, "Uncle John speaks of God's blessing in all things. The grain grows by his will, his love guides our hands, and the bread nourishes us through his grace." Her explanation was so simple, so pure in its faith, that John felt ashamed of his inability to share her certainty. She lived in a world where divine providence touched every aspect of existence, where every blessing could be traced back to its heavenly source, where doubt was simply the absence of proper understanding. Or, Marco countered with a grin that was equal parts mischief and genuine curiosity, "Grain grows because seeds are planted in good soil, and bread nourishes us because that's what bread does. Why must we add invisible explanations to perfectly visible processes?" His questions were the same ones that haunted John's sleepless nights, the logical challenges that his training had taught him to dismiss as prideful reasoning, but that his honest mind could not ignore. John watched this exchange with the heavy heart of a man caught between two worlds. Elena's faith was beautiful in its simplicity, unshakable in its certainty, radiant in its hope. Marco's skepticism was equally compelling in its honesty, refreshing in its directness, challenging in its refusal to accept easy answers. Both of them looked to him for guidance, for the wisdom that his position was supposed to provide. Still, John felt utterly unqualified to bridge the gap between their opposing worldviews when he couldn't even locate his own position on the spectrum of belief. Father Gregorio, his mentor, had been watching John with the keen eye of a man who had shepherded souls for over 50 years. His weathered face, lined with the wisdom of countless spiritual battles, often wore an expression of gentle concern when he looked at his younger colleague. One evening, as they walked together through the monastery's herb garden, Gregorio finally broke the silence that had grown between them. "You carry a heavy burden, my son," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze that rustled the lavender and rosemary plants around them. "I've watched you these past years, seen the way you pour yourself into service, as if trying to fill an emptiness that good works alone cannot touch. Would you care to share what troubles your heart? John stopped walking, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared at the ground where his shadow mingled with Gregorio's in the fading light. The invitation hung in the air like incense, sweet and sacred, offering absolution without judgment. For a moment, he considered opening his heart, spilling out the doubts and fears that had consumed him, confessing the crisis of faith that made him feel like a hypocrite every time he stood before the altar. "I'm well, Father," he replied instead, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "Perhaps I've been working too hard, caring too much for others and too little for myself. I'll be more careful to rest." The words felt like another stone added to the wall he had built around his true self, another barrier between his inner reality and the expectations of his community. Gregorio studied him for a long moment, his wise eyes seeing far more than John's carefully constructed facade revealed. "Rest is important," he agreed finally, "but the soul's weariness requires different medicine than the body's fatigue. If you ever find yourself in need of different medicine, you know where to find me." The offer was made with such gentleness that John almost broke down entirely, almost surrendered to the relief of honest confession. Instead, he nodded gratefully and changed the subject to the upcoming harvest festival, discussing the practical arrangements with the same attention to detail he brought to all his duties. They talked about decorations and music, about which families would provide food and who would help with the preparations, about all the surface concerns that kept life moving forward while deeper currents remained unexplored. As the days passed, John threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, as if external busyness could quiet the internal storm that raged within him. He visited the sick with even greater frequency, spending hours at bedsides offering comfort to those who hung between life and death. He organized food distributions for the poor, personally carrying baskets to families who struggled to make ends meet. He led evening prayers with such eloquence that villagers often commented on the power of his words, never suspecting that those words were drawn from a well of desperation rather than devotion. The autumn harvest season arrived with its usual mixture of celebration and exhaustion, as villagers worked from dawn to dusk bringing in the crops that would sustain them through winter. John blessed the fields and the workers, his hands moving through familiar gestures while his mind wandered to questions that had no easy answers. If God provided the harvest, why did some years bring abundance while others brought famine? If divine providence governed all things, why did hard-working families sometimes starve while others prospered through no particular virtue of their own? Elena found him one evening sitting alone in the chapel, his head bowed in what appeared to be prayer, but was actually a moment of complete spiritual emptiness. The silence stretched between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he wanted to cross, but her presence brought a comfort that transcended words. She knelt beside him, her young face serious with concern. "Uncle John," she whispered, "you seem so sad lately. Is there something I can do to help?" Her offer was made with such genuine love that John felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. How could he explain that her beloved uncle, the man who had baptized her and guided her first steps in faith, had lost the very thing that made him worthy of her trust? "I'm not sad, my child," he said softly, reaching out to touch her hand with fingers that trembled slightly. "I'm simply contemplating the mysteries of God's ways. Sometimes the contemplation becomes quite intense, and I suppose it shows on my face." The explanation was partially true, as the best lies always were, but it felt like another small betrayal of the honesty she deserved. "I've been praying for you," Elena said simply, her words carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "I asked God to give you peace, to show you how much you mean to all of us, to help you feel His love the way we feel yours." Her prayer was so pure, so innocent in its assumption that God listened and cared, that John felt his heart break a little more. If only faith could be transferred like a physical gift, passed from one person to another through the simple act of loving intention. "Thank you," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your prayers mean more to me than you know." In that moment, he realized that her faith, her love, her unwavering belief in his goodness might be the only glimpse of the divine he had left. Perhaps God, if he existed, spoke not through burning bushes or miraculous signs, but through the simple devotion of a young woman who saw holiness in a man who felt utterly hollow. The winter months brought their own challenges, as cold winds whistled through the monastery's ancient walls, and snow covered the village in a blanket of pristine white that seemed to muffle all sound except the constant questions in John's mind. He continued his duties with mechanical precision, leading services, hearing confessions, administering sacraments, all while feeling like an actor playing a role he no longer understood. The villagers noticed nothing amiss, so skilled had he become at maintaining his facade, but the effort of constant performance was wearing him down like water slowly eroding stone. One particularly bitter evening, as John knelt alone in the chapel before the simple wooden crucifix that had been his companion for so many years, he finally allowed himself to voice the prayer that had been building in his heart like pressure in a sealed vessel. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from disuse, but gaining strength as his desperate need overcame his doubt. "Lord," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty chapel, "if you are there, if you are listening, if you care at all about the struggles of your servants, I need to know. I have served you faithfully for 20 years, loved your people as my own, given everything I had to give, and I feel nothing but emptiness where your presence should be. I question everything, doubt everything, yet I cannot stop serving because these people need something I'm not sure I can provide." The silence that followed was so complete that John could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of centuries of prayers that had been offered in this sacred space. "I don't ask for visions or voices or miraculous signs," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I ask only for some small indication that this life of service has meaning, that the comfort I offer comes from something real, that the hope I proclaim is more than wishful thinking. If it's your will, show me a sign of your presence, not for my glory, but for the sake of these good people who trust me to guide them toward truth." The prayer hung in the air like incense, sweet and desperate, carrying with it the weight of 5 years of suppressed doubt and the humble hope of a man who had reached the end of his own resources. John remained kneeling for a long time after the words faded, listening to the silence that seemed to contain its own kind of answer. Not the dramatic response he might have hoped for, but something quieter, more subtle, like the first stirring of life in frozen ground. As spring arrived, and the village began to shake off winter's grip, John felt a strange mixture of anticipation and resignation settling over him, like morning mist. Something was changing, though he couldn't identify what it was. The familiar routines of Easter preparation took on a different quality, as if he were seeing them through new eyes. The ancient words of the liturgy seemed to carry fresh weight, the gestures of blessing felt more deliberate, and the faces of his congregation appeared more precious and vulnerable than ever before. Marco had been spending more time in the chapel lately, though his motivation seemed more intellectual than spiritual. He asked increasingly sophisticated questions about theology and philosophy, challenging John's explanations with the relentless logic of a sharp young mind. "Uncle," he said one morning after Mass, "how do you reconcile the existence of suffering with the notion of a loving God? It seems to me that either God is not all-powerful, or he is not all-loving, or he simply doesn't exist. Which explanation satisfies your reason?" The question hit John like a physical blow, so closely did it mirror his own tormented thoughts. "The mystery of suffering is one of the great challenges of faith," he replied carefully, falling back on the theological training that had once seemed so solid. "We cannot fully understand God's ways with our limited human minds, but we trust that his purposes are ultimately good, even when we cannot see how present pain serves future blessing." "But that's not really an answer, is it?" Marco pressed, his young face earnest with genuine curiosity. "That's just a way of saying we shouldn't ask the question in the first place. If God's ways are utterly mysterious to us, how can we claim to know anything about him at all? How can we build an entire life around someone we admittedly cannot understand?" John felt the familiar weight of questions he couldn't answer, doubts he couldn't resolve, mysteries he couldn't penetrate. "Faith," he said slowly, "is not the absence of questions but the willingness to live with them. We walk in partial darkness, trusting that each step forward brings us closer to the light, even when we cannot see the path clearly." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, like echoes of someone else's certainty. Elena, who had been listening from nearby, stepped forward with the gentle confidence that seemed to characterize everything she did. "Uncle John is right, Marco. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting in love, even when we can't understand everything about how that love works. Mother loved us even when she punished us for our own good, even when her decisions seemed harsh to our childish minds. How much more might God's love include elements we cannot comprehend?" Her analogy was so simple, so beautiful in its innocence, that John felt a stab of both admiration and envy. How he longed for such clarity, such unshakable confidence in the goodness of divine providence. Yet even as he appreciated her faith, he couldn't help but hear Marco's unspoken response. that human parents, however loving, were still fallible beings whose decisions could be questioned and whose love could be imperfect, while the God they worshipped was supposedly perfect in all his ways. The conversation stayed with John throughout the day, following him through his routine visits to the sick and elderly, echoing in his mind as he prepared for evening prayers. The questions that had tormented him for years seemed to be pressing closer to the surface, demanding answers he didn't have, resolution he couldn't provide. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling of his small cell, listening to the sound of his own breathing in the darkness, wondering if prayer was anything more than talking to oneself in the silence. The next morning brought news that would change everything, though John had no way of knowing it as he prepared for what he assumed would be another routine service. The day was ordinary in every visible way. The same grey sky, the same stone walls, the same familiar faces gathering in the chapel for the morning mass. "I asked God to give you peace, to show you how much you mean to all of us, to help you feel his love the way we feel yours." Her prayer was so pure, so innocent in its assumption that God listened and cared, that John felt his heart break a little more. If only faith could be transferred like a physical gift, passed from one person to another through the simple act of loving intention. "Thank you," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your prayers mean more to me than you know." In that moment, he realized that her faith, her love, her unwavering belief in his goodness might be the only glimpse of the divine he had left. Perhaps God, if he existed, spoke not through burning bushes or miraculous signs, but through the simple devotion of a young woman who saw holiness in a man who felt utterly hollow. The winter months brought their own challenges, as cold winds whistled through the monastery's ancient walls, and snow covered the village in a blanket of pristine white that seemed to muffle all sound except the constant questions in John's mind. He continued his duties with mechanical precision, leading services, hearing confessions, administering sacraments, all while feeling like an actor playing a role he no longer understood. The villagers noticed nothing amiss, so skilled had he become at maintaining his facade, but the effort of constant performance was wearing him down like water slowly eroding stone. One particularly bitter evening, as John knelt alone in the chapel before the simple wooden crucifix that had been his companion for so many years, he finally allowed himself to voice the prayer that had been building in his heart like pressure in a sealed vessel. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from disuse, but gaining strength as his desperate need overcame his doubt. "Lord," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty chapel, "if you are there, if you are listening, if you care at all about the struggles of your servants, I need to know. I have served you faithfully for 20 years, loved your people as my own, given everything I had to give, and I feel nothing but emptiness where your presence should be. I question everything, doubt everything, yet I cannot stop serving because these people need something I'm not sure I can provide." The silence that followed was so complete that John could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of centuries of prayers that had been offered in this sacred space. "I don't ask for visions or voices or miraculous signs," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I ask only for some small indication that this life of service has meaning, that the comfort I offer comes from something real, that the hope I proclaim is more than wishful thinking. If it's your will, show me a sign of your presence, not for my glory, but for the sake of these good people who trust me to guide them toward truth." The prayer hung in the air like incense, sweet and desperate, carrying with it the weight of 5 years of suppressed doubt and the humble hope of a man who had reached the end of his own resources. John remained kneeling for a long time after the words faded, listening to the silence that seemed to contain its own kind of answer. Not the dramatic response he might have hoped for, but something quieter, more subtle, like the first stirring of life in frozen ground. As spring arrived, and the village began to shake off winter's grip, John felt a strange mixture of anticipation and resignation settling over him, like morning mist. Something was changing, though he couldn't identify what it was. The familiar routines of Easter preparation took on a different quality, as if he were seeing them through new eyes. The ancient words of the liturgy seemed to carry fresh weight. The gestures of blessing felt more deliberate, and the faces of his congregation appeared more precious and vulnerable than ever before. Marco had been spending more time in the chapel lately, though his motivation seemed more intellectual than spiritual. He asked increasingly sophisticated questions about theology and philosophy, challenging John's explanations with the relentless logic of a sharp young mind. "Uncle," he said one morning after Mass, "how do you reconcile the existence of suffering with the notion of a loving God? It seems to me that either God is not all-powerful, or he is not all-loving, or he simply doesn't exist. Which explanation satisfies your reason? The question hit John like a physical blow, so closely did it mirror his own tormented thoughts. The mystery of suffering is one of the great challenges of faith, he replied carefully, falling back on the theological training that had once seemed so solid. We cannot fully understand God's ways with our limited human minds, but we trust that his purposes are ultimately good, even when we cannot see how present pain serves future blessing. But that's not really an answer, is it? Marco pressed, his young face earnest with genuine curiosity. That's just a way of saying we shouldn't ask the question in the first place. If God's ways are utterly mysterious to us, how can we claim to know anything about him at all? How can we build an entire life around someone we admittedly cannot understand? John felt the familiar weight of questions he couldn't answer, doubts he couldn't resolve, mysteries he couldn't penetrate. Faith, he said slowly, is not the absence of questions, but the willingness to live with them. We walk in partial darkness, trusting that each step forward brings us closer to the light, even when we cannot see the path clearly. The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, like echoes of someone else's certainty. Elena, who had been listening from nearby, stepped forward with the gentle confidence that seemed to characterize everything she did. Uncle John is right, Marco. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting in love, even when we can't understand everything about how that love works. Mother loved us even when she punished us for our own good, even when her decisions seemed harsh to our childish minds. How much more might God's love include elements we cannot comprehend? Her analogy was so simple, so beautiful in its innocence, that John felt a stab of both admiration and envy. How he longed for such clarity, such unshakable confidence in the goodness of divine providence. Yet even as he appreciated her faith, he couldn't help but hear Marco's unspoken response. That human parents, however loving, were still fallible beings whose decisions could be questioned and whose love could be imperfect, while the God they worshipped was supposedly perfect in all his ways. The conversation stayed with John throughout the day, following him through his routine visits to the sick and elderly, echoing in his mind as he prepared for evening prayers. The questions that had tormented him for years seemed to be pressing closer to the surface, demanding answers he didn't have, resolution he couldn't provide. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling of his small cell, listening to the sound of his own breathing in the darkness, wondering if prayer was anything more than talking to oneself in the silence. The next morning brought news that would change everything, though John had no way of knowing it as he prepared for what he assumed would be another routine service. The day was ordinary in every visible way. The same grey sky, the same stone walls, the same familiar faces gathering in the chapel for the morning mass. But something invisible was stirring, something that would soon transform not only John's crisis of faith, but the very understanding of what it meant to encounter the divine in the midst of human doubt. As John stood before the altar, arranging the simple elements of bread and wine that would soon become the center of the most profound mystery he had ever witnessed, he felt a strange quickening in his heart, as if his desperate prayer from months earlier was finally about to receive its answer. The morning light streaming through the chapel windows seemed somehow different, more alive, more purposeful, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of something extraordinary. The weight of doubt that had pressed down on him for so long began to shift, not disappearing but somehow becoming lighter, as if it were being lifted by invisible hands. John couldn't have explained this change if asked, couldn't have pointed to any specific cause or reason, but he felt it nonetheless, a subtle transformation in the very fabric of his existence that seemed to promise that everything he thought he knew about faith and doubt and the nature of divine love was about to be challenged in ways he could never have imagined. The small congregation settled into their usual places, unaware that they were about to witness something that would divide their community, challenge their understanding, and ultimately demonstrate that God's answers to human prayers often come in forms far more dramatic and mysterious than the desperate heart that seeks them could ever dare to hope. John began the familiar words of the liturgy, his voice steady and sure, not knowing that before the morning was over, those words would be transformed from empty ritual into living reality in ways that would echo through the centuries and touch the hearts of believers and skeptics alike. Earlier, before Mass, the morning that seemed identical to countless others that had come before it, yet carried within itself the seeds of transformation that would forever alter the course of his life and the lives of everyone who knew him. The crisis that had been building in his heart for 5 long years had reached a breaking point, like a dam that had held back rising waters until the pressure became too great to contain. The weight of leading others in faith while drowning in his own doubt had become unbearable, and John found himself standing at the edge of an abyss that seemed to offer only two choices: honest confession of his spiritual bankruptcy or continued deception of the people who trusted him most. Father Gregorio had found him in the early hours before dawn, kneeling in the chapel with his shoulders shaking in silent anguish. The old priest had suspected for months that his younger colleague was struggling with something deeper than ordinary fatigue, but he had respected John's privacy and waited for him to ask for help. Now, seeing the obvious distress that John could no longer hide, Gregorio approached with the gentle wisdom of a man who had witnessed many spiritual crises over his long years of service. "My son," he said softly, settling beside John on the hard stone floor, "your burden has become too heavy to carry alone. Perhaps it's time to share it with someone who understands the weight of spiritual responsibility." His voice carried no judgment, only the infinite patience of a shepherd who had seen many of his flock struggle through dark nights of the soul. John lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and tears he had been too proud to shed. "Father," he whispered, his voice breaking with the strain of maintaining his facade for so long, "I don't know if I can continue. The words I speak, the comfort I offer, the hope I proclaim, it all feels like lies. I stand before the altar every morning and consecrate bread and wine, speaking of transformation and divine presence, but I feel nothing. Nothing at all." The confession poured out of him like blood from a wound, 5 years of suppressed doubt and anguish finally finding voice. "Since Maria and Luca died, I've been going through the motions of faith while feeling completely empty inside. I tell people that God loves them, that He has a plan, that their suffering has meaning, but I don't believe any of it myself. How can I continue to lead them when I've lost the very thing that qualified me to guide them?" Gregorio listened without interruption, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his face reflecting the deep compassion of a man who had wrestled with similar demons in his own spiritual journey. When John's words finally subsided into silence, the old priest sat quietly for a long moment, allowing the weight of the confession to settle between them like incense rising toward heaven. "Do you think," Gregorio asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "that God is less present in your doubt than He was in your certainty? Do you believe that love disappears when we cannot feel it, that truth becomes false when we cannot grasp it, that the divine abandons us when we struggle to find it?" His questions were not challenges but invitations, gentle probes designed to help John discover what remained beneath the rubble of his collapsed faith. "I don't know what I believe anymore," John replied honestly, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "I feel like I'm living a lie, standing before these good people and offering them comfort I cannot find for myself. They look at me with such trust, such confidence that I have answers to their deepest questions, and I feel like a fraud who has stolen their faith through false pretenses. Or perhaps," Gregorio suggested gently, "you are a wounded healer who serves others precisely because you understand their pain. Perhaps your doubt makes you more compassionate, not less qualified. Perhaps God uses broken vessels as readily as whole ones, maybe even more readily, because they make no claim to perfection." The words carried a weight of lived experience, the wisdom of a man who had learned that spiritual authority often came not from the absence of struggle, but from the honesty with which one faced it. John considered this possibility as the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the chapel floor where they knelt. Could it be that his crisis of faith, rather than disqualifying him from service, actually prepared him to serve in ways he had never imagined? Could his doubt make him more authentic, more genuine in his compassion for others who struggled with questions they dared not voice? "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "that perhaps I should confess my doubts to the congregation, tell them honestly about my struggles, let them find a priest who can offer them the certainty they deserve." The thought had been growing in his mind for weeks, a potential solution that would at least end the daily agony of hypocrisy. "And what do you think they would say?" Gregorio asked, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement. "These people who have watched you comfort their dying, feed their hungry, shelter their homeless, tend their sick. Do you think they would condemn you for being human? Do you think they would love you less for admitting that you struggle with the same questions that keep them awake at night?" The possibility had never occurred to John, as he was so convinced that his faith was the foundation of his relationship with his congregation. But as he considered Gregorio's words, he began to wonder if perhaps his service to them had created bonds stronger than doctrine, connections deeper than theological certainty. Perhaps they loved him not because he was a perfect vessel of divine truth, but because he was a human being who cared about their welfare with genuine compassion. "I asked God for a sign," John admitted, his voice barely audible. "Months ago, I prayed for some indication that this life of service had meaning, that the comfort I offer comes from something real. I felt foolish even as I prayed, like a child asking for magic, but I was desperate for anything that might restore my sense of purpose." "And what if," Gregorio asked softly, "that sign comes in a form you don't expect? What if God answers prayers in ways that challenge our assumptions about how divine intervention should look? What if the sign you seek is not a supernatural event, but a deeper understanding of what it means to serve others in the midst of uncertainty?" Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the early morning congregation, a small handful of villagers who came to weekday mass before beginning their daily labors. John quickly composed himself, wiping away the traces of tears and assuming the demeanor that had become second nature to him. But something had shifted in the conversation with Gregorio, some small crack in the wall of his despair that allowed a sliver of hope to enter. The service that morning was smaller than usual, consisting of Elena and Marco, along with old Giuseppe, who never missed a mass regardless of weather or personal circumstance, little Anna, whose mother sent her to pray for her father's safe return from a trading journey, and 2 farmers who stopped by on their way to the fields. 7 people in total, including John himself, gathered in the ancient chapel to participate in a ritual that had been performed countless times over the centuries. John began the liturgy with his usual careful attention to each word and gesture, but something felt different this morning. The familiar phrases seemed to carry new weight, as if they were being spoken for the first time rather than repeated from memory. The faces of his small congregation appeared more vivid, more precious, as if he was seeing them with new eyes that recognized the sacred in the ordinary. "Lift up your hearts," he intoned, following the ancient pattern that had guided countless celebrations of the Eucharist. "We lift them up to the Lord," came the response, spoken by voices that carried the accumulated faith of generations. As John approached the moment of consecration, the most sacred part of the Mass when bread and wine were transformed into the body and blood of Christ, he felt a strange stirring in his chest, as if something long dormant was beginning to awaken. The words that had felt so empty for so long suddenly seemed to pulse with life, carrying meaning that transcended his ability to understand or explain. He lifted the simple piece of bread, holding it carefully in his hands as he spoke the words that Christ himself had spoken at the Last Supper. "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you." The phrase that had become routine through thousands of repetitions suddenly felt charged with significance, as if the very air around the altar was holding its breath in anticipation. As he spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The bread in his hands seemed to shimmer with a light that had no earthly source, a gentle radiance that grew stronger with each word he spoke. At first, John thought it might be a trick of the morning sunlight streaming through the chapel windows, but the light had a quality unlike anything he had ever seen, warm, alive, somehow personal in its intensity. The transformation began slowly, so subtly that John initially questioned his own perception. The bread seemed to be changing texture, becoming more substantial, more real, as if it were being infused with life itself. The light grew brighter, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the chapel, and John felt his breath catch in his throat as he realized he was witnessing something that defied every law of nature he had ever known. Elena was the first to notice the change, her sharp intake of breath audible in the profound silence that had fallen over the chapel. She dropped to her knees with a sound like a physical blow, her hands pressed to her mouth as she stared at the altar with eyes wide with wonder and terror. Marco, who had been fidgeting as usual, suddenly became perfectly still, his young face pale with shock as he tried to process what he was seeing. Old Giuseppe made a sound like a sob, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward the altar as if drawn by an invisible force. Little Anna gasped and began to cry, not from fear but from an overwhelming sense of awe that her young mind couldn't fully comprehend. The 2 farmers fell to their knees as one, their faces reflecting the same mixture of terror and joy that had transformed Giuseppe's features. John felt his own knees weaken as the bread in his hands completed its transformation, becoming unmistakably flesh. Human flesh, with the texture and appearance of heart muscle, still warm as if life flowed through it. The light that had surrounded it began to fade, leaving behind something that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. With trembling hands, he lifted the chalice containing the wine, speaking the words of consecration with a voice that shook with emotion. Take this, all of you, and drink from it, for this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." As he spoke, the wine began to change as well, becoming thicker, darker, unmistakably blood that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The silence in the chapel was absolute, broken only by the sound of Elena's quiet weeping and Marco's sharp, irregular breathing. John stood frozen at the altar, holding the transformed elements in his hands, feeling the weight of a miracle that answered his desperate prayer in ways he could never have imagined. The doubt that had tormented him for 5 years seemed to evaporate like morning mist, replaced by a certainty so profound that it felt like being born again. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My God, you have answered." The words came from a place deeper than thought, a recognition that transcended understanding. The flesh and blood in his hands were not symbols or metaphors, but living reality, the actual presence of the divine made manifest in response to his humble plea for a sign. Elena rose shakily to her feet, her face streaming with tears that reflected the light of the candles like diamonds. "Uncle John," she whispered, "what have we witnessed? What has God done here?" Her voice carried the awe of someone who had looked directly into the face of mystery and been forever changed by the encounter. Marco, who had spent months challenging every aspect of religious faith, found himself speechless for the first time in his life. The logical arguments that had seemed so compelling in the abstract crumbled before the evidence of his own senses. He couldn't deny what he had seen, couldn't explain away the transformation that had occurred in front of his eyes, couldn't reduce the miracle to natural causes or psychological suggestion. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice small and confused. "I don't understand how this is possible." The admission came from a young man who had prided himself on his rational skepticism, who had believed that everything in the universe could be explained through natural law and logical analysis. John looked at each face in turn, seeing in their expressions the same mixture of terror and wonder that he felt in his own heart. "I believe," he said slowly, "that God has chosen to reveal himself to us in a way that transcends our understanding. This is not something we can explain or rationalize. It is something we can only witness and receive with humble hearts." The words felt strange in his mouth, coming from the same throat that had voiced doubt and despair just hours earlier. Yet they carried a conviction that surprised him, a certainty born not from theological training, but from the undeniable reality of what lay before them. The flesh and blood on the altar pulsed with life, defying every law of nature, while simultaneously affirming the deepest truths of faith. Old Giuseppe struggled to his feet, his arthritic joints protesting the sudden movement, but his eyes blazed with a fire that made him seem decades younger. "Father John," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "in all my 70 years, I have never seen anything like this. God has blessed us, blessed this humble place, with a miracle that will echo through the ages." His weathered hands shook as he crossed himself, the simple gesture carrying the weight of a lifetime's devotion suddenly vindicated. Little Anna approached the altar with the fearless curiosity of childhood, her tear-stained face lifted toward the transformed elements with wonder rather than terror. "Father," she whispered, "is that really Jesus? Is he here with us now?" Her question cut through the complexity of theological explanation to the heart of the matter, spoken with the directness that only children possess. "Yes, my child," John replied, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "He is here with us in a way more real than we have ever experienced before. This is his gift to us, his response to our need for his presence." The answer came naturally, flowing from a well of faith that had been refilled by miracle, restored by divine intervention that exceeded his wildest hopes. The two farmers, brothers named Pietro and Santo, remained on their knees, their faces reflecting the same awe that had transformed the others. They were simple men, more comfortable with soil and seed than with theological mysteries, but they recognized the sacred when they encountered it. "What should we do?" Pietro asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we respond to such a gift?" Before John could answer, the chapel door opened and several late arrivals entered, expecting to find the usual quiet morning service. Instead, they found themselves confronted by a scene that defied description. 7 people gathered around an altar where the impossible had become manifest, their faces reflecting wonder that transcended ordinary human experience. Among the newcomers was Lorenzo, the village baker, whose skeptical nature had made him a frequent sparring partner with John on matters of faith. His eyes swept the chapel, taking in the kneeling figures, the transformed atmosphere, the unmistakable sense that something extraordinary had occurred. "What's happening here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to practical explanations for unusual events. Elena turned toward him, her face still streaming with tears, her voice trembling with the effort to find words for the impossible. "Lorenzo, we have witnessed a miracle. The bread and wine, they became flesh and blood before our eyes. God has revealed himself to us in the most profound way imaginable." Lorenzo's expression shifted from curiosity to skepticism to something approaching scorn. "Elena, you're a good girl, but you're also young and impressionable. Surely you don't expect us to believe that bread magically transformed into flesh? There has to be a reasonable explanation for whatever you think you saw." Marco, who had been silent since the transformation, suddenly found his voice. "Lorenzo, I've spent months arguing with Uncle John about the impossibility of miracles, questioning every aspect of religious faith. I came here this morning prepared to find more reasons to doubt. But I saw what Elena saw, what we all saw. The bread became flesh in Father John's hands. I watched it happen. I can't explain it, but I can't deny it either." The conviction in Marco's voice was perhaps more shocking to many than the miracle itself. Here was a young man who had built his identity on rational skepticism, who had challenged every supernatural claim with logical analysis, now testifying to the reality of something that defied every natural law. His words carried the weight of reluctant conversion, the authenticity of someone whose worldview had been shattered by undeniable evidence. Lorenzo pushed forward, his eyes fixed on the altar where the transformed elements remained. "Show me," he demanded, his voice carrying the challenge of someone who had spent years dismissing religious claims as wishful thinking. "If this is real, if God has truly performed a miracle here, then show me the evidence." John lifted the chalice and the vessel containing the flesh, his hands remarkably steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. The blood had coagulated into distinct globules, each one perfect in its formation, dark red and unmistakably human. The flesh bore the texture and appearance of heart muscle, complete with fibers and chambers that could only have come from a living being. Lorenzo's face went pale as he stared at the transformed elements, his skeptical confidence crumbling before the evidence of his own eyes. "This isn't possible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Bread doesn't become flesh. Wine doesn't become blood. There has to be a trick, an illusion, something that explains this without resorting to supernatural intervention." "Touch it," John said quietly, extending the vessel toward Lorenzo with steady hands. "Feel the texture, examine it closely. Use your baker's knowledge of grain and yeast and flour. Tell me if this is anything you have ever seen come from an oven." Lorenzo hesitated for a long moment, his practical nature warring with his growing realization that he was confronting something beyond his understanding. Finally, he reached out with trembling fingers and touched the flesh, his face reflecting shock at its warmth, its unmistakably organic texture, its obvious authenticity. "My God," he breathed, his voice breaking with the weight of sudden belief. "My God, this is real. This is actually happening." The transformation in his expression was as dramatic as the miracle itself, skepticism giving way to wonder, doubt dissolving into faith born from direct experience. Word of the miracle spread through the village with the speed of wildfire, carried by tongues that could not remain silent about what they had witnessed. By midday, the chapel was packed with people who had come to see for themselves, to judge with their own eyes whether the impossible had truly occurred in their humble church. The crowd spilled out into the courtyard, creating a buzz of excitement and controversy that had never before disturbed the peaceful rhythm of Lanciano. The reaction was immediate and divisive. Some, like Elena and Giuseppe, received the news with joy and wonder, seeing in the miracle a confirmation of everything they had always believed about God's presence in the world. Others, influenced by Lorenzo's initial skepticism, demanded proof, evidence, and a scientific explanation for what they were told had occurred. Still others dismissed the entire event as mass hysteria, collective delusion, or outright fraud. Marco found himself in the unexpected position of defending the miracle he had witnessed, his credibility as a skeptic lending weight to his testimony. "I understand your doubts," he told a crowd of questioners who had gathered around him in the village square. "I've spent months raising the same objections, asking the same questions. But I was there. I saw it happen. The bread became flesh before my eyes, and no amount of logical argument can change that reality." His words carried particular power, because everyone knew of his previous skepticism, his habit of challenging religious claims with rational analysis. If Marco, of all people, was testifying to the reality of a miracle, then perhaps there was something to investigate rather than dismiss. But not everyone was convinced. A group of villagers, led by the merchant Carlo and the blacksmith Benedetto, began circulating rumors that John had somehow staged the entire event, using sleight of hand or hidden preparations to create the illusion of transformation. They pointed to his recent behavior, his apparent spiritual struggles, and his possible desperation to restore his reputation as a holy man. Think about it, Carlo argued to anyone who would listen. A priest who has been acting strangely for months suddenly produces a convenient miracle just when his faith is being questioned. It's too convenient, too perfectly timed to be genuine. There has to be a rational explanation that doesn't require us to believe in magic. Benedetto nodded vigorously, his massive frame and booming voice adding weight to Carlo's arguments. I've known John since he was a boy. He's a good man, but he's also human. Perhaps the pressure of his position, the weight of everyone's expectations, drove him to desperate measures. Perhaps he convinced himself that deceiving us would be justified if it restored faith in God. These accusations cut John to the core, adding a new dimension of suffering to what should have been the most joyful moment of his life. The miracle that had answered his desperate prayer for a sign of God's presence had indeed transformed his own faith, but it had also created a division in his community that threatened to tear apart the very relationships he had spent his life nurturing. Elena became his most passionate defender, her young voice rising above the crowd's murmur with fierce conviction. How can you accuse Father John of deception when you know his character? How can you suggest that a man who has spent his life serving others would suddenly become a fraud? I was there, I saw the transformation with my own eyes, and I would stake my life on its authenticity. But her defense only deepened the divide, as some villagers began to question whether she, too, had been deceived, whether her love for her uncle had blinded her to the possibility of manipulation. The miracle that should have united the community in wonder instead became a source of bitter controversy, splitting families and friendships along lines of belief and skepticism. John found himself caught in the middle of this storm, his own transformation from doubt to faith overshadowed by the community's descent into division. The sign he had prayed for had come, but with it came consequences he had never imagined. The flesh and blood on the altar remained as evidence of divine intervention, but they also became focal points of controversy that threatened to destroy the very community he had hoped to serve. As the days passed, the miracle's impact spread beyond the village boundaries. Travelers carried news of the event to neighboring settlements, and soon pilgrims began arriving in Lanciano, drawn by reports of the supernatural transformation. Some came seeking healing, others came seeking proof, and still others came to debunk what they saw as another example of religious fraud. The pilgrims brought with them their own questions, their own demands for evidence, their own interpretations of what had occurred. The simple chapel that had witnessed the miracle became a site of constant activity, with visitors examining the transformed elements, interviewing the witnesses, and drawing their own conclusions about the event's authenticity. John watched this influx of strangers with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was gratified to see that the miracle had touched lives beyond his own small community, that God's sign had reached people who desperately needed hope and faith. On the other hand, he mourned the loss of the intimate, personal nature of the original experience, the way the miracle had become a public spectacle rather than a private revelation. The transformed elements themselves showed no signs of decay or deterioration, remaining as fresh and vital as they had been on the morning of the miracle. This preservation, which should have been additional evidence of their supernatural nature, instead became another source of controversy. Skeptics argued that the lack of decomposition proved the elements were not actually organic tissue, while believers saw it as further confirmation of divine intervention. Father Gregorio, who had been away visiting another monastery during the miracle, returned several days later to find his quiet religious house transformed into a center of pilgrimage and controversy. His first reaction was one of deep concern for John, whom he found exhausted by the constant attention and questioning that surrounded the event. "Tell me what happened," Gregorio said quietly, drawing John aside for a private conversation in the monastery's garden. "Tell me not what others are saying, but what you yourself experienced." John's account was simple and direct, stripped of the theological interpretations and emotional embellishments that had accumulated around the story. He described his crisis of faith, his desperate prayer for a sign, the morning service with its small congregation, and the transformation that had occurred during the consecration. His words carried the ring of truth, the authenticity of someone who had experienced something beyond his ability to fully understand or explain. "And now," Gregorio asked, "how do you feel about what has happened?" "Grateful," John replied without hesitation. "Grateful that God answered my prayer, even though the answer came in a form I never expected. Grateful that my faith has been restored, even though it has created new challenges. Grateful that others have witnessed God's presence, even though it has divided our community." "And the accusations?" Gregorio pressed. "How do you respond to those who claim you engineered the entire event?" John's face showed the pain that these suggestions had caused him. "I understand their skepticism. I shared it myself for 5 years. But I know what I experienced, and I know that no human agency could have produced what occurred in that chapel. The flesh and blood on the altar are real as the transformation that occurred in my own heart." Gregorio studied his colleague's face, seeing in it the peace that comes from an authentic encounter with the divine. "Then we must trust that God will vindicate his own work in his own time. Meanwhile, we must continue to serve these people, both those who believe and those who doubt, with the love that has always guided your ministry." The conversation with Gregorio helped John find his equilibrium in the midst of the storm that surrounded him. He began to see the controversy not as a failure of the miracle to convince everyone, but as a natural consequence of divine intervention in human affairs. God's signs had always been met with mixed reactions, accepted by some and rejected by others, depending on the openness of the heart that encountered them. As the third part of his story approached, John felt a deep sense of anticipation mixed with trepidation. The miracle had answered his personal prayer for faith, but it had also set in motion forces beyond his control. Soon, he knew, the church hierarchy would become involved, bringing with them the weight of official investigation and the possibility of either vindication or condemnation. The simple village priest who had asked for a sign was about to discover that God's answers often came with complications that tested faith in ways that went far beyond the original request. The news of the miracle at Lanciano reached the Vatican with the speed of all extraordinary claims, carried by pilgrims, merchants, and traveling clergy who had witnessed the growing controversy surrounding the transformed elements. In the corridors of ecclesiastical power, where religious phenomena were met with careful scrutiny and healthy skepticism, the reports from the small Italian village were initially dismissed as another example of popular superstition mixed with priestly ambition. However, as more witnesses came forward and the story gained credibility through repetition, church officials began to take notice. Archbishop Rodriguez, a man whose reputation for theological rigor was matched only by his skill in investigating claimed miracles, received the assignment to travel to Lanciano and conduct a thorough examination of the alleged supernatural event. Rodriguez was known throughout the church as someone who approached such claims with the analytical mind of a scholar and the spiritual discernment of a seasoned priest. His previous investigations had resulted in debunking fraudulent claims rather than in confirming genuine miracles, a record that made him both respected and feared among clergy who preferred their mysteries to remain unexamined. The Archbishop's arrival in Lanciano was preceded by messengers who announced his coming with the gravity befitting a papal representative. The village, already divided by the miracle, became further polarized by the prospect of an official church investigation. Those who believed in the authenticity of the transformation saw Rodriguez's visit as an opportunity for vindication, while skeptics viewed it as the beginning of the end for what they considered an elaborate deception. John received news of the Archbishop's impending arrival with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because an official investigation would finally provide authoritative judgment on the miracle's authenticity, potentially ending the speculation and controversy that had consumed the village for weeks. Terror because he knew that Rodriguez's reputation for thoroughness meant that every aspect of the event would be examined with microscopic detail, including his own role in the transformation. The Archbishop arrived on a grey morning in late spring, his impressive entourage including several theologians, a physician, and a notary whose job was to record every detail of the investigation. Rodriguez himself was a tall, imposing figure whose weathered face reflected the decades of study and spiritual discipline he had undergone. His dark eyes seemed to miss nothing as he surveyed the village, the monastery, and the chapel where the miracle had allegedly occurred. John's first meeting with Rodriguez was formal and intimidating. The Archbishop's questions were precise, probing, and designed to uncover any inconsistency or deception in the priest's account. "Tell me about your spiritual state in the months leading up to this alleged miracle," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. John found himself recounting his crisis of faith, his years of doubt, his desperate prayer for a sign of God's presence. The admission was painful, requiring him to confess his spiritual struggles to a man whose approval could determine the rest of his career. But he spoke honestly, recognizing that any attempt at deception would likely be detected by someone of Rodriguez's experience and insight. "So you were struggling with doubt," Rodriguez summarized, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with analysis. "You felt spiritually empty, questioned the reality of divine presence, and then conveniently experienced a miracle that restored your faith. Do you not see how this sequence of events might appear suspicious to those who approach such claims with appropriate skepticism?" The question was clearly designed to test John's response to the obvious criticisms of his account. "I understand the suspicion," John replied carefully. "I shared it myself for years. But I know what I experienced, and I know that no human hand could have produced the transformation that occurred during the consecration. The flesh and blood on the altar are real as the change that occurred in my own heart." Rodriguez's examination of the transformed elements was thorough and methodical. He spent hours studying the flesh, noting its texture, color, and preservation. He examined the blood, observing its coagulation and the perfect formation of each globule. He questioned the witnesses repeatedly, comparing their accounts for consistency and searching for signs of coaching or collaboration. Elena faced the Archbishop's interrogation with quiet dignity, her faith unshaken by the intimidating presence of church authority. "I know what I saw," she said simply when pressed for details. "The bread became flesh before my eyes. I cannot explain how or why, but I can testify to its reality." Marco's testimony carried particular weight because of his well-known skepticism. "I came to that mass prepared to find more reasons to doubt," he told Rodriguez. "I had spent months challenging every aspect of religious faith. But I saw the transformation occur, and no amount of logical argument can change that reality." The Archbishop's physician, Dr. Matteo Santori, conducted his own examination of the transformed elements using the limited scientific tools available in the 8th century. His findings were startling. The flesh showed all the characteristics of human cardiac tissue, complete with the complex structure of heart muscle. The blood was clearly human, with a type that would later be identified as AB, though such classification was centuries in the future. "In my medical opinion," Dr. Santori reported to Rodriguez, "these elements are genuine human tissue and blood. They show no signs of artificial preparation or chemical treatment. The preservation is remarkable, defying natural laws of decomposition. I cannot explain their origin through any known natural process." But it was Rodriguez's own examination of the blood that provided the most startling evidence of supernatural intervention. As he carefully weighed the 5 coagulated globules, he discovered something that challenged everything about physics he had ever learned. Each individual globule weighed exactly the same as any combination of the others. Whether he measured one alone, 2 together, 3 at once, or all 5 simultaneously, the weight remained identical. At first, Rodriguez assumed his scale must be malfunctioning. He tested it repeatedly with other objects, confirming its accuracy with materials of known weight. But when he returned to the blood globules, the impossible remained consistent. Each part weighed the same as the whole, defying every principle of mathematics and physics. Each time he measured their weights, he was stunned. The theological implications of this discovery were profound. Rodriguez recognized it as a physical manifestation of the Catholic doctrine of Christ's complete presence in each fragment of the Eucharist. The blood globules were demonstrating, in measurable terms, the mystery of divine indivisibility that theologians had long proclaimed but never expected to observe in physical reality. "This is not possible according to natural law," Rodriguez murmured as he repeated the weighing process for the 10th time, his scientific mind reeling from the implications. "Each part cannot weigh the same as the whole, unless we are dealing with something that transcends physical reality entirely." The Archbishop's investigation continued for several more days, during which he interviewed every witness, examined every aspect of the miracle, and consulted with his theological advisors about the implications of their findings. The village watched anxiously as the official representatives of the church deliberated, knowing that their decision would determine not only the fate of the miracle, but the future of their community. Some villagers, emboldened by the Archbishop's presence, stepped forward with new accusations against John. Carlo the merchant repeated his claims of fraud, while Benedetto the blacksmith suggested that the priest had used his recent travels to other monasteries to learn techniques of deception. These accusations were investigated with the same thoroughness as the miracle itself, Rodriguez's team searching for any evidence of preparation or staging. But their investigations revealed nothing suspicious. John's character was vouched for by dozens of villagers who testified to his years of selfless service. His recent behavior, rather than indicating preparation for fraud, suggested genuine spiritual struggle and exhaustion. The physical evidence of the transformation remained inexplicable through natural means. The pressure of the investigation began to affect John's health. The constant questioning, the persistent suspicion, the weight of representing not only his own integrity, but the authenticity of divine intervention, as well as the integrity of the witnesses, all combined to create a burden that threatened to crush his newly restored faith. He found himself praying not for vindication, but for strength to endure whatever judgment the church might render. Elena, seeing her uncle's suffering, became even more passionate in her defense of the miracle. "How can you continue to doubt?" she asked Rodriguez during one of their interviews, "when the evidence is so clear? How can you question the authenticity of something that has transformed not only the bread and wine, but the hearts of everyone who witnessed it?" "Because," Rodriguez replied with the patience of someone who had conducted many such investigations, "the Church has a responsibility to distinguish between genuine divine intervention and human deception, between authentic miracles and wishful thinking. The eternal souls of the faithful depend on our ability to discern truth from falsehood." As the investigation neared its conclusion, tension in the village reached a breaking point. Believers and skeptics faced off in heated debates that sometimes threatened to become physical confrontations. The miracle that was supposed to bring peace had instead brought division, separating families and destroying friendships that had lasted for generations. John found himself at the center of this storm, his own transformation from doubt to faith overshadowed by the community's descent into controversy. The sign he had prayed for had come, but with it came consequences he had never imagined. The flesh and blood on the altar remained as evidence of divine intervention, but they had also become symbols of everything that divided the village. On the final day of his investigation, Rodriguez gathered the entire community in the chapel for his official pronouncement. The small space was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out into the courtyard. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and anxiety as the Archbishop prepared to deliver his judgment. "After careful examination of all the evidence," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded space, "after interviewing all the witnesses, after consulting with medical and theological experts, after testing every aspect of the alleged miracle, I must render my official judgment." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the collective breathing of hundreds of people hanging on every word. John felt his heart pounding as he waited for the verdict that would determine not only his own fate, but the spiritual future of everyone present. The transformation of bread and wine into flesh and blood that occurred in this chapel represents a genuine miracle, Rodriguez announced, his words falling like thunderbolts into the stunned silence. "The physical evidence is undeniable, the witness testimony is consistent and credible, and the spiritual fruits of the event confirm its divine origin. I hereby declare this miracle authentic, and authorize its veneration by the faithful." The explosion of emotion that followed Rodriguez's announcement was unlike anything the village had ever experienced. Believers wept with joy, skeptics stood in stunned silence, and John collapsed to his knees in overwhelming gratitude. The vindication he had hardly dared hope for had come from the highest authority in the church, confirming that his desperate prayer had indeed been answered by divine intervention. But Rodriguez was not finished. "However," he continued, raising his voice above the celebration, "I must also address the division that this miracle has created in your community. God's signs are given not to create controversy, but to inspire faith, not to divide but to unite. The authenticity of the miracle does not diminish the legitimacy of honest questions or the value of thoughtful skepticism." The Archbishop's words began to heal the wounds that the investigation had opened. Those who doubted were not enemies of faith, but careful guardians of truth. I myself had serious doubts. Those who believed were not gullible fools, but open hearts receiving divine grace. Both responses have their place in the community of faith, and both groups must now work together to understand what God has revealed through this extraordinary event. Rodriguez announced that the transformed elements would be enshrined in a special reliquary, protected and preserved for future generations to venerate. The chapel would become a shrine, a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to encounter the divine presence that had manifested itself so dramatically in the humble village of Lanciano. John's restoration was complete, but it came with new responsibilities. The priest who had struggled with doubt was now the guardian of one of the church's most extraordinary miracles. The man who had questioned God's presence was now the instrument through which that presence had been made manifest to the world. As the months passed, pilgrims began arriving in increasing numbers, drawn by reports of the miraculous transformation and the preserved elements that defied natural law. The simple chapel was enlarged to accommodate the crowds, and John found himself ministering to visitors from across Europe who came seeking healing, hope, and confirmation of their own faith. Elena married a young man from a neighboring village, her faith strengthened by the miracle she had witnessed. Marco, his skepticism transformed into wonder, entered the monastery as a novice, dedicating his life to studying the theological implications of what he had seen. The village, once divided by the miracle, gradually found unity in its shared role as guardian of an extraordinary gift. Lorenzo the baker, his initial skepticism completely overcome by the evidence he had examined, became one of the miracle's most eloquent defenders. He often told visitors, "I was a man who believed only in what I could see and touch and prove. But I touched the flesh that had been bred, and I was forced to acknowledge that reality extends far beyond what our limited senses can perceive." The transformed elements continued to defy natural law, showing no signs of decay or deterioration year after year. The flesh remained as fresh as the day of the miracle, the blood as vivid and vital as when it first appeared. Scientists and theologians came to study them, but none could explain through natural means how organic tissue could remain perfectly preserved without any form of artificial treatment. John's own transformation was perhaps as remarkable as the miracle itself. The priest who had been tormented by doubt became a beacon of faith, his sermons drawing crowds from distant regions. But he never forgot the darkness he had endured, and his compassion for those who struggled with questions made him an especially effective counselor for doubters and seekers. "I understand your questions," he would tell visitors who came to him with their own crises of faith. "I lived with them for 5 years, and they nearly destroyed me. But I learned that doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is faith's shadow, following it everywhere, sometimes obscuring it, but never fully conquering it. The miracle I witnessed was not an answer to my questions, but a demonstration that love transcends understanding." Father Gregorio, now elderly but still sharp, often reflected on the way God had used John's crisis to prepare him for his unique role as guardian of the miracle. "Perhaps," he suggested to John one evening as they walked through the monastery garden, "your years of doubt were not obstacles to overcome, but preparation for the extraordinary responsibility you now carry. Perhaps God allowed you to experience the full weight of human questioning, so that you could minister with authentic compassion to all who struggle with faith." The miracle's impact extended far beyond the village of Lanciano. Word of the transformation spread throughout Christendom, inspiring faith in some and challenging skepticism in others. The preserved elements became objects of pilgrimage, symbols of divine presence that had manifested itself in response to a humble priest's desperate prayer. As John entered the final phase of his life, he often returned to the chapel where the miracle had occurred, kneeling in the spot where his faith had been restored by divine intervention. The transformed elements remained in their reliquary, as fresh and vital as ever, continuing to bear witness to the reality of God's presence in the world. True events inspire this story, but the facts about the miracle are remarkable. Centuries later, the miracle continued to impact lives in ways the humble priest could never have imagined. In 1971, Dr. Odoardo Linoli, a professor of anatomy and pathological histology, conducted scientific tests on the preserved elements using modern techniques unavailable in the 8th century. His findings confirmed what believers had proclaimed for over 1,000 years. The flesh was genuine human cardiac tissue, the blood was human blood of type AB, and both showed no signs of artificial preservation. The blood had protein distributions typical of fresh blood, despite being centuries old. The tests revealed that the flesh contained all the proteins and minerals found in normal human tissue, with the same proportions found in living cardiac muscle. The blood showed the presence of proteins that would have disappeared within hours in typically preserved blood, yet remained intact after more than a millennium. Most remarkably, the tissue showed signs of having been traumatized, as if it had been subjected to severe stress or torture. The flesh was identified as human myocardial tissue, which is heart muscle, from the left ventricle, with structures like arteries, veins, and adipose tissue visible. It showed the characteristics of living tissue, responding to clinical tests as if freshly sampled. The flesh, described as a precise tangential cut of heart tissue, was deemed unlikely to have been artificially prepared, as such a sample would require the skill of a trained pathologist, which was implausible for the 8th century. Linoli's report explicitly stated that no traces of preservatives or chemical agents were found in the samples. This is significant because the relics, over 1,200 years old and never hermetically sealed, should have deteriorated under normal conditions. Linoli noted that blood from a cadaver would have rapidly decomposed, yet these samples retained properties of fresh tissue. These scientific findings, conducted using the most advanced techniques available, only deepened the mystery of the Lanciano miracle. The preserved elements continued to defy natural law, challenging scientific understanding, while confirming the faith of millions who had venerated them over the centuries. Other similar miracles occurred in subsequent years, each bearing remarkable similarities to the Lanciano event. In Orvieto in 1263, bread and wine transformed into flesh and blood during Mass, leading to the institution of the Feast of Corpus Christi. In Buenos Aires in 1996, a consecrated host that had been discarded in water transformed into cardiac tissue that, when tested, proved to be from a human heart that had endured severe trauma. All these miracles shared common characteristics. The flesh was always cardiac tissue, the blood was always type AB, and both showed signs of having come from someone who had suffered greatly. The consistency of these findings across centuries and continents suggested a divine signature, a pattern that transcended human ability to fabricate or fake. The story of John's crisis and restoration, of the miracle that answered his desperate prayer, became a source of hope for countless believers who struggled with their own doubts. His journey from certainty to doubt, and then to a deeper faith, grounded in a direct experience of the divine, spoke to the universal human struggle to find meaning and purpose in the face of suffering and uncertainty. As pilgrims continue to visit the shrine at Lanciano, they encounter not only the preserved elements of the miracle, but the legacy of a priest who was honest enough to admit his doubts, humble enough to ask for help, and open enough to receive an answer that exceeded his wildest expectations. The miracle stands as a testimony to the reality of divine love, the power of authentic prayer, and the truth that God's responses to human need often come in forms far more extraordinary than the seeking heart dares to imagine. Share your doubts and questions in the comments. Let's explore faith together.